Welcome to a TBN special, Israel Under Fire. I'm Erick Stakelbeck, and over the next hour, we'll take an in-depth look at the chaos unfolding in the Middle East right now and what it means for Israel, America, and Christians around the world. Over the past several days, terrorist groups in Gaza have fired thousands of rockets at Israel. These rocket barrages have driven millions of Israelis into bomb shelters and have targeted major population centers like Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Hamas, which rules Gaza with an iron fist, has been the main source of the rockets. It's been joined in its onslaught by a group called Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Both are supported, funded, and armed by Iran. Israel has hit back with heavy airstrikes that have decimated Hamas's military capabilities. It's also eliminated several top Hamas leaders. Yet the rockets continue to fall. At least a dozen people in Israel have been killed since the violence began, while close to 200 Palestinians have reportedly been killed as well. Israel says many of those Palestinian casualties are Hamas and Islamic Jihad members. This latest round of hostilities began on May 10th in Jerusalem as Palestinians clashed with Israeli police. They blamed Israel for supposedly defiling the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. Hamas entered the fray soon after, unleashing a rocket barrage on Israeli cities that has yet to let up. So, where does it all go from here? And what comes next in the world's most pivotal region, the Middle East? We're joined by experts on this subject, most of which are on the ground in Israel right now, as we take an in-depth look at Israel Under Fire. We are joined now by Israel's former ambassador to the United States, former Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister and founder of The Truth About Israel, Ambassador Danny Ayalon. Ambassador, welcome. Great to have you with us.
My pleasure, Aaron. Always good to be with you.
Yes, you know, you've been out front and center, Ambassador, over the past several days, making the case for Israel in this current conflict against terror groups in Gaza, chief among them Hamas. You made a great point recently, I saw you in the media, that the international community is saying all sides need to rein in the violence and stop the escalation. But there's really only one side, Ambassador, that is behind this onslaught, and that's Hamas. Could you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we have to understand Hamas is part and parcel of this Islamic Brotherhood or a Muslim Brotherhood movement, which is a very radical Islamist, a sister, I would say, a sister organization to the infamous ISIS. They are sworn on the destruction of the state of Israel. They say it's in their manifestos, it's in their credo, it's how what they teach their people and their children. So basically, they are at war with us, and for that matter, with the entire Western Christian Western world or the Judeo-Christian community. You know that Aaron, in 2005. Israel left Gaza altogether, gave it to the Palestinians with the hope that they can build something out of there and we would help them and we would coexist and from there change the dynamics of the conflict. But we left. We left and up to the last inch. That was 2005. 2006, Hamas took over. They threw out the Palestinian Authority in a kind of a coup. They are now de facto the rulers of Gaza since 2006. And since then, basically, we have an open war. We didn't wage the war. They are the ones who waged the war on us. They call it the open war. So we have seen here now a war of 15 years, which has been interspersed by intervals of some truce or ceasefire. But basically, it's all connected to the same jihad, as they call it, this holy war, where they're trying to get us out of our homeland and establish here a Sharia law and an Islamic caliphate. And of course, we are not going to let it happen. We feel very strong because we are at home. This is our land. And there is another thing. What makes us so strong is that we don't have anywhere else to go. So they may try and may try again. We are here in the trenches, but we feel here that we stand here for the entire free world.
Ambassador, I think you make a great point. In 2005, every last Israeli evacuated Gaza, essentially the Gaza withdrawal, the disengagement. There are voices saying this current war is about Israeli occupation, but there are no Israelis in Gaza. So what is Hamas's goal here? They continue to fire rockets, thousands in the past week alone. What is the ultimate goal of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad? And another key point, these Iran-backed terror groups in Gaza?
Yes. Well, simply put, they want to destroy the state of Israel. It's not a matter of quote-unquote settlement or not settlement. For them, the entire state, as far as they are concerned, is an illegal settlement. Why? Because, according to them, there shouldn't be any non-Muslim land or world in the entire Middle East as a start. Then they would like to go even further. They would like to go back to where they were in the Middle Ages when they conquered almost all of Europe. At that time, the United States or America was not yet discovered. But they, together with the Ayatollahs of Iran, ISIS, they are all, I would say, strains of the same company or the same family. You have the Shiites extremes, the Ayatollahs in Iran. You have the Sunni extremes, which is the Hamas in Gaza, and the ISIS in Syria or in Iraq, and they work together. So for them, they cannot fathom, they cannot tolerate a non-Islamic land or a non-Islamic nation. And especially it comes to Jerusalem. You know, Jerusalem, which is the eternal capital of the state of Israel, has been that for the last 3,000 years and more since King David built it. Since then, unfortunately, you know, we had by the way, just like the prophecy shows, we were expelled twice. Now we're back building the third home. And just according to all the prophets, we are here now forever. The Islamists, of course, will not tolerate it. So we have the Temple Mount, which is the holiest place. This is where the two Jewish temples stood. Right now, there is a mosque on top. We are not going to change the mosque, but what they're trying to do is bring about hundreds of thousands of Muslims, young Muslims, where they incite them to come and to throw out the Jews.
You know, you were ambassador to the United States from 2002 to 2006 during the height of the Second Intifada, ambassador, that vicious uprising against Israel. We've seen over the past week, like you just laid out, unrest on the Temple Mount, Palestinian rioting, even in mixed cities where Jews and Arabs live side by side, places like Lod, Acre, Haifa, Jaffa, Arab riots there as well. Are you concerned that we could see perhaps a third intifada in the days to come?
Yes, I'm very much concerned. It's a very explosive situation. It's like history comes back again. And of course, we have no choice but to defend ourselves. And at the end of the day, we prevail.
The true occupier of the Palestinian people seems to be the leadership, the Palestinian leadership, ambassador. Hey, but through it all, as you said, Israel continues to not only survive, it thrives. Ambassador Danny Ayalon, thank you so much for joining us. Always great to see you. Keep it up.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much, and God bless.
And we are joined now by Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, international spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces, joining us from Tel Aviv. Lieutenant Colonel, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I know you are a very busy man right now, to say the least. Could you give us an update, Jonathan, on, first of all, the damage that has been done to Hamas and Islamic Jihad and their terror operations in Gaza over the past several days?
Eric, I'd like to start actually with the damage in Israel, because that is what is most paramount to us. And unfortunately, we have casualties. Just now, this is Tuesday afternoon hours, there was another rocket attack that unfortunately hit southern Israel and caused at least 2 fatalities, 2 additional civilians that are now dead because of rockets, as well as 2 wounded in the same attack. This was an afternoon barrage of rockets from Gaza towards southern Israel, and unfortunately, additional toll in human life. And we have now crossed the 11 mark, 11 civilian Israelis killed by rockets, and substantial damage to infrastructure and facilities in the areas where those rockets have landed. And I'm talking about all over Israel. Central Israel, a city close to Tel Aviv, as well as Ashdod, Ashkelon. These are cities in the south, as well as rural communities around the Gaza area that we refer to as the Gaza envelope. So this is a significant effort. It has significant impact on Israeli lives, and it is by far the most intense period of rocket fire that Israel has ever been under, if you take the amount of rockets fired and the time that they have been fired in. We're talking about an average of around 600 rockets per day, a total of 3,300 rockets fired in a span of 8 days.
And the sheer volume, Jonathan, as you said, Hamas last week said that it fired some 130 rockets in a span of 5 minutes into southern Israel. Talk about the volume, number one. But secondly, you mentioned it's not just southern Israel right now, which is bad enough. It is central Israel, Tel Aviv being barraged on a regular basis now, greater distance with this Hamas terror onslaught.
Yeah, these are very dangerous and bold moves by Hamas. This is an aggression that they are going to pay dearly for. We've been very clear with our intentions from the beginning. The Prime Minister, the Chief of the General Staff, the Minister of Defense communicated right away as soon as they fired at Jerusalem, our capital, and continued to fire at other parts of Israel. The message from Israel was very clear. This is an aggression that will not stand, and it will not go unanswered. And since then and until now, we've been attacking their infrastructure and degrading enemy capabilities. We've attacked different parts of Hamas's infrastructure, and I'll elaborate if you're interested. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is making Hamas pay a price. We're attacking them wherever they are as a response to this specific, very massive attack that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad have orchestrated against Israel.
The Israel Defense Forces have eliminated several top Hamas and Islamic Jihad commanders. Jonathan, speaking of the infrastructure, can you tell us about something called the Metro, this vast underground tunnel network that Hamas has been using but no longer will use after the Israel Defense Forces have really decimated it?
Yes. So I'll explain the importance of that underground infrastructure that we nicknamed the Metro, not because it's for civilian use. Don't be confused. There are no civilians using that underground network. It's only for the Hamas terrorists. That is where they hide. That is what allows them to fight. It's really at the core of their combat doctrine. Imagine that aerial supremacy was taken from Israel. That is the equivalent of what Hamas are facing now. We are degrading their capability to move freely underground and to conduct operations underground, safe from our intelligence efforts and from the Air Force and from our fire capabilities. That is the importance of this event. It is, I think it cannot be overstated at this time. It's a big change for Hamas, and it's going to take a lot of time for them to adapt to it. What we've done is to systematically map that underground network using different technological tools that we've enhanced and developed, intelligence capabilities, so that we now have a layout of what was a city beneath a city. It was basically a city network underneath Gaza City and many other parts of the Gaza Strip, which Hamas and the Islamic Jihad have spent years building, and this was really at the heart of their military concept. This is what enabled their operations. That's why we've been attacking it. That's why we've been focusing lots of efforts, firepower, air power, intelligence, etc., on finding those places and basically causing the infrastructure to collapse, with the aim of making it very difficult for Hamas to continue operating now and also in the future. In addition to that, what we've also done is we've been focusing on different groups of targets. As you said, we've taken out quite a lot of senior Hamas and Islamic Jihad operatives. We have focused intensely on the R&D efforts that Hamas have been spending lots of money on. We've been focusing on their infrastructure, production, as well as storage of rockets. And we've been hunting the rocket launchers and any squad of terrorists who dare to go above ground and actually expose themselves. We've been hunting those, and we've been quite successful. Not enough yet, but we've been quite successful in negating those effects. Overall, a massive campaign is ongoing. There are significant military achievements, but we are by no means done yet.
There's a lot of concern, of course, about civilian casualties. Can you talk about how Hamas and other terror groups in Gaza put civilians in harm's way intentionally, and how the Israel Defense Forces goes to extraordinary lengths to avoid civilian casualties?
Eric, I'll be very blunt. Hamas is getting away with murder because they're using their civilians as human shields, and they're using every part of civilian infrastructure for their military purposes. There is not one single piece of Hamas military infrastructure that is in an isolated military area and defined as such. Everything that Hamas has, all of their combat infrastructure, is either in or under civilian infrastructure, and that is by design. That's how they want it, because they want it to be virtually impossible for us to attack those systems and degrade them without causing what we know as collateral damage.
Yeah, and Jonathan, not to mention hundreds of Hamas rockets have fallen inside Gaza and killed Palestinian civilians. Rockets intended to strike Israel falling inside Gaza. As you said, a double war crime, to say the least. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Eric. As always, a pleasure. Shalom from Tel Aviv.
We're joined now by Israel's former ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer. Ambassador, great to have you with us. You know, as I'm looking at the situation right now, one of the big, largely, unfortunately, untold stories seems to be the role of Iran in this round, and really every round of hostilities with Hamas. This doesn't seem like great timing to revive a nuclear deal with the Iranian regime as they are supporting and supplying Hamas. You've been such an eloquent voice on that. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on the possible reemergence of the Iran nuclear deal amid all this chaos?
You're quite right, Eric. Iran is a hidden hand behind a lot of this. And wherever you look in the Middle East and you have a problem, Iran is probably behind it. They stir the pot in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza. Within Gaza, there are two terror organizations operating there. There's probably others, but the two main ones are Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran, gets their directives directly from Iran. They admit publicly, and they did even just in recent days, that Iran gives them all the money, all the expertise, and all the arms to fire these rockets at Israel. In addition to that, you have Hamas, another Islamic terror organization. They are backed by Iran. Iran pays them a lot of money and gives them enormous support. And there's no question that without Iran's support, Hamas would not be the organization that it is today. So I agree with you. If you're looking at just this conflict itself, a lot of people are not talking about, who is the big country that is behind what is going on in Gaza. And there's no question that Iran is behind it. And I would say, in a larger sense, any idea to return to the nuclear deal that was agreed to by the major powers of the world, the so-called P5+1, in 2015, the idea of returning to that deal is a terrible, terrible mistake that would be very harmful to the security of Israel, very harmful and dangerous to the security of our Arab neighbors, particularly the ones we made peace with several months ago. And I think it's very bad for stability throughout the region. And I think it's very bad for the United States of America, because that deal, I'll remind you, Eric, you were in the trenches back then, arguing, also making the case of why this deal was so dangerous, is because that deal doesn't block Iran's path to the bomb. It puts restrictions on Iran's nuclear program that after a few years are automatically removed. So you don't actually block Iran's path to the bomb. You actually pave that path to a bomb, not just one bomb, but an entire nuclear arsenal, because when those restrictions are not in place on Iran's nuclear program, they won't then need to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They'll just walk into the nuclear club. But beyond that, what the nuclear deal did is it paved that path to a nuclear arsenal with gold, because it removed all the sanctions. And Iran was facing very tough sanctions. All those sanctions were removed in 2015. Tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars started to pour into the Iranian coffers. And as I said at the time, when we were talking about what was going to happen if they would sign a nuclear deal, they weren't going to use that money to establish a GI Bill for returning members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They were going to use it to fuel their campaign of carnage and conquest throughout the Middle East. As I mentioned, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza. And so it was very, very dangerous. And we were very grateful when President Trump decided to withdraw from that nuclear deal. It took him about a year and a half of his administration to withdraw from the deal. And then we were even more grateful, or equally grateful, I should say, when President Trump put crippling sanctions on Iran. And the most crippling sanctions that were put on Iran had to do with their inability to sell oil on the financial markets. That was the big money. The Trump administration choked Iran of those funds. And they reduced their exports of oil from about 2.8 million barrels a day to about 300,000, 400,000 barrels a day about a year ago. That's a 2.5 million barrel a day difference. Now, the price of oil is $60, $70, and $60 or $70, that's $150 million a day. That's $4.5 billion a month. That's $50 billion a year. And over 10 or 15 years, you're talking about vast sums of money that are going to actually finance this terror arsenal, and to get more rockets to Hamas, to get more support for Hezbollah, to have more rockets in the hands of the Houthis who are firing at Saudi Arabia. So this deal was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster. And we are encouraging, and we still implore the Biden administration, do not go back into the nuclear deal with Iran. It will be very, very dangerous for Israel's national security. We hope they won't do that. And one other thing, I know this is a short answer to a long question, but one other thing I want to tell you, and that is there is an argument today in Washington that says this maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration put on didn't work, and particularly Secretary of State Pompeo, who was so forceful in pushing this forward. There's an argument that say it didn't work, it didn't bring Iran to its knees. Well, that's true, it didn't bring Iran to its knees, but it also starved that regime of all this cash that it was going to use on this campaign of terrorism and support for terrorism throughout the region. Why didn't it bring Iran to its knees? Well, one of the reasons was that the Iranian regime, and Israeli intelligence knows this, and U.S. intelligence knows this, the Iranian regime was hoping that that pressure will be removed. They hoped that in 18 months there would be a presidential election and a new administration would come into office that would go back to the nuclear deal and actually give up on the sanctions. Now, why did they believe that? Because that's what the incoming administration was saying. So it's very important to understand that Iran was given a lifeline. Sort of hold your breath for a year and a half for May 2019 when all these pressures were put in place. Hold it for a year and a half, and afterwards, you'll be free. You'll be right back in business. That's why I would implore the Biden administration, do not go back into that nuclear deal. It is very dangerous for Israel and very dangerous for the region, and it will set back the calls of peace, which we advanced so much in the last year.
One of the interesting developments over the past week or so has been the UAE standing with Israel, condemning Hamas terror. Can you talk about these new relationships that are forming? Okay, we have that Iran axis on one side, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, etc. But exciting things are happening between Israel and its Sunni Arab neighbors. For people who say Israel does not want peace, the facts on the ground say otherwise.
Yeah, and it's hard to think about that when you see the scenes coming out of Israel now and the violence coming out of Israel. But you're quite right, Eric. We had some serious breakthroughs in the region only last year. And why did we have those breakthroughs? Well, you had a strategic change in the Arab world, a recognition that Iran is a grave danger to them, as it is to Israel. That Sunni radicalism, Iran is a Shia radical power. You also have a Sunni radical power. Al-Qaeda was 1.0, ISIS is 2.0, and there'll be a 3.0. So those regimes are very worried about it. And another factor is the perception that the United States is actually withdrawing its military forces from the region. And what that tells those Arab states is here you got that Iranian threat and you have an ISIS or whatever comes next threat, and the 800-pound gorilla is leaving the building. And they look around and they see in Israel a 200-pound gorilla, maybe with a kippah on their head. And they say, well, we should work with them on confronting common enemies. Then you had a U.S. administration that actually implemented a very smart American policy, and I'm going to make it as succinct as possible. It was confront Iran and embrace Israel. When they confronted Iran, they brought the Arab states closer to Israel. And when they embraced Israel, remember, we made these peace agreements. These breakthroughs happened after the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, after they recognized Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights, after they actually recognized Israel's historic rights to parts of Judea and Samaria, and the whole changing of the paradigm for peacemaking, things that most of the people who are in this peacemaking business said would set back the cause of peace, they did the very opposite. Why? Because the Arab states recognized, wait a second, the United States is backing Israel. And if we want to get closer to America, we should get closer to Israel. That's what enabled this breakthrough. And it's a very big deal. We had to wait. We had our first peace treaty with Egypt in 1979. We had to wait 15 years for a second peace treaty with Jordan in 1994. It took us a quarter century to go from the second peace treaty to the third. And then from the third to the fourth was only a month. And from the fourth to the sixth was only another couple of months. And so obviously something is changing in the region. And this policy of confronting Iran and embracing Israel, that helps advance peace. And our hope was that our new Sunni Arab partners, the peace, will be a real peace and a deeper peace than we had even with Egypt and Jordan, because those peace treaties, unfortunately, the peace we have with them is a cold peace, which is certainly better than a hot war, but it hasn't been a people-to-people peace. And what we've seen thus far from the Emiratis is that the peace is not only between leaders, but it's also between people. We have Israelis going to Abu Dhabi, going to Dubai. We have people from the Emirates coming to Israel, people from Bahrain, people from Morocco, back and forth travel. And I think the possibilities are endless. And I tell you, especially with the Emirates, hopefully we'll be able to push back against Hamas now, to restore security to the people of Israel, to restore deterrence against these violent attacks, and continue on the path of peace, which we set out several months ago. And we believe that that offers great hope and promise for the future.
Yeah, and the resiliency of the people of Israel is just always amazing to see, Ambassador. And despite the threats, as you just laid out, great and encouraging things are happening as well. Ambassador Ron Dermer, as always, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Eric.
Hey guys, we're here in downtown Jerusalem in the Shuk, the open market. For many people, this place, this open market is sort of the iconic cityscape of the city of Jerusalem. And more than anyone else, the citizens of this city and the cities around the country are the ones most affected by this recent conflict. So we want to hear what they have to say. We want to hear straight from them how this conflict between Israel and the Hamas is affecting everyday life for the people on the streets of this country. What are your feelings like during all these recent events?
Well, I'm extremely concerned. Especially I'm concerned with how this whole conflict is being represented in the media worldwide, because I think that there is false symmetry that is to be presented in all the different outlets. People think that Hamas is some kind of organization that is like a country, that is like a state, it's like a government, but they don't remember that it's a terrorist organization. You can't actually negotiate with these people. The whole morality system is very different than any other Western country.
I was sitting in the room at home that I use as an office, which is actually the bomb shelter in my house. I'm lucky enough to have one. Most Israelis do not have bomb shelters in their houses, but I'm living in a new building. And when I didn't hear the siren, and after the bang, I called my wife in and we closed the door and locked it up and waited it out.
It's very scary to be living in a place that until a couple of days ago it was safe to go in the street and just go out with friends and have fun, and suddenly it's not so sure. Also, I have a brother who's a soldier, so it makes things we always check up the news, make sure everything's okay with him, speak to him all the time. and it's very unsuring, and it gives you like a feeling of like it's not safe.
Feeling
Scary.
of anxiety.
Yeah.
Just now, as we speak, just very moment, we have 2 casualties, 2 dead people in the Gaza envelope from a direct rocket that fell on an Israeli settlement. So they don't see that. They don't show them exactly what happens here when the alarms goes off and people are running and hitting each other sometimes. I know people are trained, but all the time there's some kind of a little bit of panic. You can see that sometimes. They don't see our side, almost nothing of our side. They only see the other side most of the time.
Israelis are really frustrated. I think there's a sense of like frustration and sadness because this was going to be when everything went back to normal, and instead we're kind of seeing this much more intense back at home, much more intense round of conflict.
Give us an example of something that people miss about what's happening here.
I think they are missing that Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza are not the same, because the Palestinians in Gaza are held captive by Hamas. They are very poor people, and they need to live under very terrible circumstances because of this Hamas regime that is really very cruel to them. It's a fundamentalist Islamic organization. And I think it's very sad that people don't know that when you say free Palestine of Israel, they don't understand that what you're supposed to say is free Palestine from Hamas.
So just today, I've been getting some people writing back to me because they listened to an interview with Bennett that was talking with somebody from Al Jazeera, and the guy was saying and kind of claiming that, oh, look at you, because Bennett was saying about him being in the bomb shelter with his children, and he said, the guy who interviewed him was saying, but the people in Gaza, they don't have bomb shelters. This is not true. The problem is we hide in the bomb shelters. In Gaza, they shelter their bombs there. That's what happened. They dig down in the ground, and this is where they keep their rockets and missiles before they shoot them into Israel.
What do you think a way out of this could be?
I think that Israel is not in any interest to bomb places in Gaza and to hurt the civilians there. I think it's very clear to everyone in Israel that this is not the agenda.
I hope for that after this situation, both sides will wake up, will understand that we have now to lick our wounds, we have now to rebuild, and why should we go to another round and another round? Why should we do that as opposed to concentrating, trying to all together pray for the peace of Jerusalem?
I wish that this would be a true Jewish country. There's plenty of Arab countries, not many Jewish countries. In fact, there's only one, which is the one we're in right now. So I wish this would be a true Jewish country, and they can walk in the street without any fear. You can hold the Israeli flag up, and people will cheer for you and not stone you, and to be able to live in peace.
If you are just joining us, Israel is at war. Hamas and other Iran-backed terror groups in Gaza have bombarded Israel with thousands of rockets over the past 10 days alone. Israel has responded with heavy airstrikes that have decimated Hamas's military capabilities. And yet, the rockets continue to fall. We're talking with top experts on this issue on the ground in Jerusalem. Let's go to one right now. We're joined now by Israel's former ambassador to the United States, former Knesset member, Dr. Michael Oren. Michael, great to have you with us. You've seen these conflicts many times over the years, even as you were ambassador in Washington, D.C. What makes this current round between Israel and Iran-backed terror groups in Gaza different?
Well, what makes different is that, first of all, the beginnings of it are rather murky. There was kind of a perfect storm. The Palestinian decision not to hold elections, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, now entering the 16th year of his 4-year term and not letting Hamas run against him, so Hamas gets angry and shoots at us. It was the Muslim holiday in Ramadan. It was the Jerusalem Day parade in Jerusalem. All of these different things, including our own political here, combined to make this. So it's very difficult to boil it down to a 7-second soundbite to explain how this happened. But the bottom line, Eric, is always the same bottom line. This is happening because Hamas is a terrorist organization dedicated to our destruction. And that is immutable. That never changes. which is why they have now fired something like 2,500 rockets. If that's not the definition of a terrorist organization, I don't know what is.
Yeah, and yet the world, the international community, many diplomats, even in the United States, Ambassador, have called on all sides to show restraint and have voiced concerns about Israel's conduct in this conflict. You obviously worked as ambassador for Israel during the Obama administration. Some of those key figures are back now working in the Biden White House. What was your strategy as ambassador, as a statesman? How do you approach when you have such international opposition in many ways? How does Israel get the message out in this climate?
Not easy. I feel it's our duty to keep trying. Many Israelis just say, to heck with it. You know, we try to show that, try to put people in our place. Well, how would you like it if you woke up one morning and all of a sudden there were rockets raining down on your house, your community, that someone you'd never met is trying to destroy you, to annihilate you? What would you do? What measures would you take? And if someone said to you, hey, what you're doing is disproportional, and yet, no matter what you did, the rockets are still falling, you would do more, wouldn't you? You wouldn't do. You wouldn't listen to people saying, hey, that's you're overdoing it. You're overdoing what it takes to defend your family. And you wouldn't do that. Of course not. That Israel, nevertheless, I think is leader in terms of taking extraordinary measures to reduce civilian casualties, absolute minimum. And it's extremely difficult because we're fighting an enemy who hides behind his own civilians, uses them as civilian shield. We've been fighting against a system of tunnels and bunkers underground. Most of them go under houses, under school. I believe that we don't bear moral responsibility for what happens to those schools. Hamas does.
We talk about an occupation of Gaza. It seems like Hamas and the Iranian regime are occupying Gaza because Israel has not been there since 2005. Can you talk about the Iranian hand, which is a theme throughout the region, but in particular in this conflict as well?
No, it's Iran is the major financial backer of Hamas. Iran is the sole backer and manager of Islamic Jihad, the other major terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip. 90% of the rockets being fired at us, Eric, are made in Iran. Those that aren't made in Iran are made by Iranian-trained engineers in Gaza. So it's all about Iran. And Iran is perfectly willing to fight Israel to the last Palestinian. It's great for Iran. It diverts attention from Iranian efforts to transform Syria into a full base against us. So certainly this conflict is in Iran's interest. And by the way, it's one of the reasons that Israel doesn't want to get dragged in too deeply on a ground campaign. That would, in certain ways, yes, it may serve Israeli interests, but it would mostly serve Iranian interests. They'd love to have us bogged down in a ground war. What baffles me is that the same people who are calling for a ceasefire are calling for renewal of the 2015 JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which will ultimately not only allow Iran to become a nuclear power, I guarantee that, but will give Iran not tens of billions of dollars, but hundreds of billions of dollars. And they're not going to build schools or hospitals. They're going to build more tunnels, more rockets, and they will place this entire region, not just the Gaza Strip, the entire region on a path to war. Of that, I am absolutely certain. Absolutely certain.
Ambassador Michael Oren, thank you so much for your insights. We always appreciate it. Thank you. We are joined now from Jerusalem by the editor-in-chief of All Israel News, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg. Joel, it's great to have you with us. You know, we were talking before we went on camera here about what a tense situation it is in Israel right now, not only with the rockets, of course, falling from Gaza, but some of the internal unrest between Israelis and Arabs. Could you tell us a bit more about that and the atmosphere on the ground right now in Israel?
Be happy to, Eric. Look, I would say that we have been through a hellish week. More than 3,200 rockets fired at Israel so far. Let's keep in mind each one of those, each one is a double war crime. These are rockets being fired from civilian positions in Gaza, from schools, from mosques, from factories and apartments and community centers and hospitals, playgrounds. And they're being fired, and that's a war crime in itself, that the Palestinian terrorists, the Hamas, Islamic Jihad, are using the Palestinian people as a human shield. it's also a war crime that they're firing at Israeli civilians, at our schools, at our playgrounds, at our hospitals and synagogues and churches and apartment buildings and factories and businesses. It's been a nightmare situation. Millions of Israelis living in bomb shelters, and Palestinians don't have bomb shelters, right? They've got terror tunnels that the only people that get to go in those are the terrorists themselves. So it's been brutal. I would say hellish, and we really haven't seen anything like this since 2014. But as you say, the other element of this is something that we haven't seen. You'd have to go back almost 21 years to 2000, when Arab extremists, almost in a brown shirt capacity from the Nazi years, are attacking Jews on the streets in many mixed communities here in Israel. Burning down synagogues, just setting cars on fire, smashing windows, beating and even killing Israeli Jews. But at the same time, there are Jewish Israeli vigilantes beating Arabs on live television. It's been a nightmarish situation, and never have we needed to pray for the peace of Jerusalem more than this. But something wicked has been unleashed here, and it's unnerving.
Yeah, and it's at a time where, obviously, Joel, there's great political disunity in Israel. It seems that Israel's enemies, perhaps, are seeing that and maybe trying to take advantage.
My analysis is slightly different. You're right. Israel has been, deeply divided politically, but this has unified us mostly. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Benny Gantz, two people that have tried to stab each other in the back and have been at each other's throats, metaphorically speaking, for the last several years. These two guys are working closely together on a common mission to crush, to defeat, certainly to degrade Hamas's terrorist capacities and Islamic Jihad. So in a strange way, it's pulled Israel together politically, even though we're watching the breakout of terrible civil unrest. Again, not over the entire country. The vast majority of Arabs, the vast majority of Jews are praying for each other, are wanting to see peace on both sides, but we are seeing this. I would say more likely Hamas is being directed by Iran to exploit what they perceive as weakness in the Biden administration, right? The Biden administration began the new year, their new administration, by taking the Houthi terror organization, the proxy of Iran, off the terror list in the United States. Why is that significant? It's significant because the Houthis in Yemen are firing rockets and missiles at the Saudis, and yet the Biden administration has been criticizing the Saudis and letting up on the Houthis. That was the exactly wrong signal, and Iran is trying another proxy force, too, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, to say, what else can we do to try to divide the U.S. from Israel and her Arab allies?
Yeah, and you had a fascinating piece on your site, All Israel News, this week, Joel, basically saying this could be considered, what's going on right now with Hamas and Gaza, somewhat of a dress rehearsal for a future war to the north against another Iranian proxy, Hezbollah.
Yeah, well, this would be maybe not the worst case scenario, but the next really bad scenario, right? A worst case scenario would be a full-on regional war with Iran if Iran had, nuclear weapons. We're not there yet, thank God. But a horrific scenario, one that I write about in my political thriller, the new one, the Beirut Protocol, it would be a third Lebanon war. Now, in this case, Eric, we've already had 9 rockets fired from Lebanon in recent days, 2 different batches, at Israel. And that has raised the possibility, the fear, that a new front could be opened with Hezbollah. Why would that be so bad? Because Hezbollah has 150,000 missiles, not just small rockets, but full-on missiles based in Lebanon, aimed at Israel. And as you'll recall, you've covered these things for years. You're an expert in this. But as you'll recall, and your viewers will recall, in 2006, during the second Lebanon war, Hezbollah, the terror proxy force in Lebanon, fired 4,000 missiles at Israel during a 34-day period. Okay? Now, senior Israeli officials that I've interviewed for All Israel News, and when I was researching the book, The Beirut Protocol, they tell me that rather than 4,000 over a month, Hezbollah could fire 4,000 missiles a day at Israel. That would dwarf anything that Hamas is doing. And we pray that does not happen.
Tell us more about that, the reaction in the Arab world to this, and the future for the Palestinian people as well, as they try to push forward under this tyrannical Hamas leadership, not to mention the not-so-friendly leadership of Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority.
Sure, absolutely, Eric. Thank you for asking. Let me take that in reverse order. I think the first thing to know is that we as evangelical Christians, as Christians all over the world who love Israel, the best way we can show compassion for the Palestinian people, obviously, is to pray for calm, right? But also for Israel to defeat the terror regime of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I'm saying it outright on Fox, on many other networks. I'll say it here on TBN, on your program. We need to pray that God will liberate the Palestinians of Gaza, not from Israel. Israel hasn't been there since 2005. We don't have a single soldier on the ground in Gaza. We don't have a single citizen on the ground in Gaza. Gaza needs to be liberated, but they need to be liberated from Hamas and Islamic Jihad. It is the one, I would say it's the most wicked and tyrannical and cruel regime on the planet. It is inviting destruction on the people of Gaza, of several million who live there, and they have no place else to go. Right? So compassion would say, we're not asking for de-escalation on both sides. Look, both sides are to blame. No, one side is to blame, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and they need to be routed out. They need to be defeated, and the Gazan people to be liberated. That's the most important thing.
We will also be praying for, obviously, the safety of Israel, and we will be praying for the peace of Jerusalem. Joel Rosenberg, thank you so much for joining us as always. I will see you this year in Jerusalem. God bless you. Take care.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be with you.
We are joined now by Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, welcome. You have been a stalwart voice in support of Israel, not only during this ongoing conflict this past week, but in general since your time in the Senate. What do you think so far about America's response, in particular the new administration, to what's going on right now in this Hamas onslaught against Israel?
Well, what's occurring in Israel is horrific. The people of Israel are facing relentless rocket attacks from Hamas terrorists, and it is unfortunately the direct result of misguided U.S. foreign policy, of mistakes that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris has made. You know, it's striking just to compare where we are in the Middle East today versus where we were a year ago. Last year, we were seeing historic peace agreements, the Abraham Accords being signed, peace blossoming throughout the region. Now we're seeing an active shooting war playing out, war in the Middle East. And the thing that changed is we no longer have a president that stands unequivocally with Israel. The peace we saw in the Middle East last year was the direct fruit of the Trump administration making clear that America stands unequivocally and unshakably with our friend and ally, the state of Israel. And there were two decisions in particular that the Trump administration made that were pivotal to causing the Abraham Accords to be signed. One was the decision to move our embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. That was a decision I strongly advocated the president to take. Notably, both the State Department and Defense Department opposed moving our embassy, and President Trump agreed with me, and he overruled his own Secretary of State, his own Secretary of Defense, moved the embassy. Eric, I was there in Jerusalem the day the embassy was open, and there was dancing in the street. It was the 70th anniversary of the creation of the modern state of Israel. The second decision that was closely intertwined was the decision to withdraw from the catastrophic Obama-Iran nuclear deal. And I don't think it was coincidental. That was announced the same week we opened our embassy. And in both instances, what it made unequivocally clear to our friends and to our enemies is we stand with Israel. And I'll tell you, Eric, I spoke with the foreign ministers and the ambassadors of the UAE and Bahrain at the time of the signing of the Abraham Accords, and both said almost exactly the same thing. They both said, listen, it is now clear to us that America stands unequivocally with Israel. We want to be friends with America, so therefore we will be friends with Israel. And it produced peace. It worked. What did Joe Biden do? He came in and immediately began undermining Israel, immediately began undermining Prime Minister Netanyahu, immediately began sending over $100 million to the Palestinian Authority. U.S. taxpayer funds are helping fund the rockets that are targeting Israeli civilians. And Biden's #1 foreign policy objective is to re-enter the disastrous Iran nuclear deal and to send billions of dollars again to the Ayatollah Khamenei, who chants death to America and death to Israel.
Yeah, Senator, this seems like very bad timing to re-enter that Iran nuclear deal when, as you said, the Iranian regime is behind the carnage right now, supplying, arming Hamas terrorists in Gaza.
The reason Hamas is engaged in hostilities right now is they know the Biden administration will play the moral relativism game. We'll say, you know, we'll blame Israel for defending itself. And it doesn't make any sense. You know, we're seeing Hamas also do things, and this is a long pattern, where they use human shields. They use innocent people to defend their military assets, whether it is putting missiles in kindergartens, which they have done in Gaza, whether it is basing the headquarters of Hamas in the basement of a hospital and literally using Palestinian mothers and newborn infants as human shields, or whether it is locating a major Hamas office in a building with the Associated Press. And right now we're seeing the Biden administration and the media playing the role of useful idiots, where when Israel acts against Hamas and they take out the building that is also headquartered in the Associated Press, all of the press grasp their pearls and say, goodness gracious, how could you do such a thing? Israel has a right to defend itself, has an obligation to defend itself, and terrorists are utterly illegitimate.
For every American watching right now, could you just lay that case out again real quick? Number one, why we should care about what happens over there thousands of miles away in the Middle East. And number two, Senator, you are a strong believer. What can Christians here in the United States do to make our voices heard in support of Israel right now in this dire, dire moment of need for the Jewish state?
Well, the scripture commands us to pray for Israel. And that is something we should do, particularly at this time of war that is playing out there. But it is also very much in the interest of U.S. national security to have a strong Israel, to support Israel. I am the leading defender of Israel in the United States Senate, and that's something I set out to do when I was first elected to the Senate 9 years ago. Is to lead the fight to standing with Israel because it is in the national security interest of the United States. Israel is our closest ally in the region. Israel shares our values. Israel is a democracy. It protects human rights. It allows political participation. Israel stands with us, and the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of America. There is a reason when the Ayatollah leads mobs chanting, they chant death to America, they chant death to Israel. The two are intertwined, and I'll tell you, we gain enormous benefits from our military support for and involvement with Israel. The United States sends about $3 billion a year in military assistance to Israel. That is used to fund their military, to fund their intelligence activities. And we get massive benefits from that because that military is used to deter and to fight against the enemies of America who want to kill Americans. That intelligence is used to understand what the Iranian regime is doing, to understand what radical Islamic terrorists are doing. And we get massive benefits in terms of keeping America safe because Israel stands alongside us. And I would note also, we're seeing one of the real benefits of Israel's great technology and missile defense, the Iron Dome system, which is an amazing missile defense system that is intercepting many of these missiles Hamas is firing. Right now, they are going through their stock of munitions for Iron Dome. The Biden administration, I believe, needs to step forward and say the United States is going to help Israel replenish those Iron Dome munitions so that there can continue to be active missile defense in Israel. And I would point out that missile defense keeps everybody safe. You know, a very interesting point Prime Minister Netanyahu made several years ago when he was contrasting Israel's approach to Hamas's approach. He said they use their citizens to protect their missiles. We use our missiles to protect our citizens. And there's a big contrast between the two. And you asked what Christians can be doing. We should, number one, be praying. We should, number two, be speaking out and making the case that these are not equivalent anymore than the thief who breaks into your house at night and seeks to do harm to your family is equivalent to the person defending his or her home against the thief. They're not the same. They are quite different, and terrorism should never be acceptable.
Absolutely. Senator Ted Cruz, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your great work on behalf of Israel and America at the Senate. We really appreciate it. As followers of Jesus, we are called to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So I encourage you, pray for God's holy city. Pray for the entire nation of Israel for their security during this difficult time. Also, do not forget to pray for the Palestinian people who are suffering under the tyrannical rule of Hamas. Also pray for the leadership in Israel and right here in the United States for wisdom and discernment and for support for America's closest ally in the Middle East. You know, folks, as I watch this unfold, it is very personal for me. I'm in Israel at least 5 times per year filming for TBN, and some of my nearest and dearest friends live in that land and are in bomb shelters right now, clutching their children in their arms. It's an image I cannot get out of my head. As Christians, we have a duty to shine a light in the darkness for Zion's sake, to not keep silent as we see this going on. The truth will set all of us free. What happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. Here at TBN, we are committed to bringing you the truth about the world's most pivotal region and how it affects all of us, no matter where we live. Thanks for joining us, and God bless.